All right, it is time to wire the XS400 build, and for this video my goals are to show you guys some really universal type information that's going to help you wire any motorcycle that you have in front of you. This system is going to be based around an X21 Plus P, which is what you would call maybe a smart controller. So this is from NWT Cyclotronic. I know they make a newer version now, but regardless, the information that I'm going to share here can also apply to like a MotoGadget M unit like this. We're basically talking about inputs and outputs and how to get everything where it needs to go. So the focus of this video is going to be showing you guys how to kind of break this up into various systems, whether it be power distribution, doing your ignition side of things, doing your inputs maybe from the controls, and then wiring the outputs out to maybe your turn signals and lights and that kind of thing. So grab a beverage and a notepad, get comfortable, and hopefully by the end of this you guys will feel a lot more confident in wiring your projects than you were before you started. Now, as we get going with the wiring harness build, I have to say, I know that this can be daunting for a lot of you guys. It's also daunting for me, and I've done this a bunch. So I've delayed as much as I can on this, and I finally just have to get it done. I know it's going to take me a while, and I know it might take you guys a while, but trust me, you just take bite-sized chunks and you can get through this. Now, with that being said, I'm going to take you guys over to the whiteboard, and I'll show you guys exactly what I mean by breaking this thing down into bite-sized chunks. All right, we're over the whiteboard right now, and this is actually going to be one of the more handy tools that we have. So I've also got a bunch of dry erase markers, and it's going to be arts and crafts up in here. All right, let's get this organized. We have a motorcycle. So let's kind of go ahead and talk about these 5 categories. So first up, we're going to have power distribution. So within this category, we're going to have things like your battery. I'm going to consider the starter solenoid to be part of that because that's where our main fuse is located in this instance. I will put main fuse in here because sometimes you do have an external main fuse. I'm also going to include the key or your ignition switch. So that's going to kind of wrap up the power distribution side of things. The next category I'm going to put is the ignition side of things. For this, you have coils. Kind of a sublet of that one is going to be spark plugs. Not really an independent wiring item, but you know, that's part of the ignition. Beyond that, you might have a CDI type bike, a points-based bike, or an electronic ignition. We'll put EI for that one. And then finally your kill switch. Okay. I'm trying to figure out how to write over here without blocking the light that's above this. It's kind of tricky. Next up, we're going to have our charging system. This is going to have your stator. I'm going to also include the rotor with that one. Now, depending on your bike, if you have maybe a CDI type bike, you might have a magneto. So your magneto can obviously be part of the ignition system too, but in this instance, we need this to be the charging system because it typically has a permanent magnet type setup, which helps create the charge for the bike. After that, we have our regulator rectifier. I can't read that, so I'm not expecting you guys to, but just know that that's rectifier. Next up, we have control inputs. These are, of course, going to be in various formats depending on how you have your controls set up. Now, for your control inputs, you're going to have things like your headlight, signals, kill switch, horn, brakes, ignition, and maybe even accessory. Your outputs are going to be basically the same thing. So headlight, signals, your ignition power, so your kill switch, the horn, the brake light, and then maybe an accessory. So we're going to put same as input. But the way we do the outputs is going to be different because we're going to be using different gauge wiring. So there you have it. We have 5 different categories, and these are going to be our bite-sized chunks to help take the stress out of trying to tame the entire flying spaghetti monster at one time. We're just going to take bites, and we're going to get one section done at a time. So for me, I like to start out with the power distribution side, which means we're going to start with our battery and also our starter solenoid. So I'm going to go ahead and move the camera around. We'll get the bike set up, and we'll start focusing on that aspect of it. We'll get power where it needs to go, and then we'll start branching out from there. Now we're going to start with the battery. I have that in a custom mount down below the bike using the center stand here. So the battery sits up like that when tightened, and our goal is to run the battery cables from here in front of the swing arm and up to our starter solenoid, which I know is hard to see. If you guys have seen the previous video, my goal is to kind of hide the electronics and actually try to route this in an entirely different way. So just because I'm routing it this way doesn't mean it's the best way to do it. I'm just trying something different, as I do with every bike. Now, taking a look at the starter solenoid, this is where we have to really pay attention here. You notice that red dot? So you can see the brass terminal that actually extends from this post and goes upwards. So this is going to be our main fuse right here. And so this post actually comes across and it ties in your top two terminals right there. So the solenoid itself, whenever you actually click the starter, you're only activating these bottom two. So you just have to remember the layout here. And there will be diagrams for all of this for the stuff that you buy. But the one with the brass terminal here, this is where your main battery positive will connect. This side will be the starter. So you definitely don't want to get that confused. So you got to realize if you put your battery right here, there's not going to be any continuity into the terminals up there, so you're not going to have any power flowing through the bike. So you want to make sure you're putting it in the right spot.
For our battery cables, I prefer to oversize things by using a 6-gauge cable, but in most cases, 8-gauge is perfectly fine. I pair these with 6-gauge cable lugs that have a 1/4-inch hole and are pre-tinned. I get those from a local battery supplier. To crimp these, I use my cable lug crimper from iWis, which I bought a couple years ago. It is adjustable for various lug sizes and creates a perfect hexagonal crimp every time. For battery lugs, I also prefer to solder them after crimping for a better connection. To do that, I first apply some rosin flux to the cable before installing the lug. After confirming the position of the lug on the cable, I then perform my crimp. Once completed, I set the cable in my vise and apply heat on the lug until the flux is flowing and hot enough to melt the solder. Then you apply the solder. This will be very hot for a few minutes, so let it cool down before you handle it.
All right, we are test fitting our positive cable. You can see I have it attached there. And what I've done, this is very important, I have the cable ran towards the center of the bike to give it a little bit of slack. And then it's ran up. So that's it coming from right there. And then right there you can see my lug that's already on the solenoid. So this is to kind of give myself an idea of where I need to cut it and how far back I need the actual sheathing to be cut. So I'm going to go ahead and mark it. We'll cut it, we'll finish this cable. All right, as you can see, I have my battery cable. It looks really trashy right now. But this is all about order of operations. So I have my heat shrink on the battery side, and then I have my actual loom that I'm putting over this for a little bit of protection. I have that on and then kind of wadded up. I have a larger piece of heat shrink over that, and that piece is going to fit over the the actual loom as well as the boot for the solenoid end. So it's all very critical that you get this stuff done in the exact order, because I have forgot this stuff a lot of times. So I've already got the end cut here, and then you can see I have that mark going down the back side, and that's to clock everything correctly. That way when we get it on the bike, we know that it's not going to have any weird turns in it. So now we can go ahead and do what we did before. I'll put some flux on this, and then we'll crimp our end on, and then we'll go ahead and put some solder on it. Short cables always get a little worrisome because you don't want to get too much heat down here because it can then heat shrink this before you want it to, and that usually sucks. So this is 3-to-1 adhesive lined heat shrink, also known as and sometimes like marine type heat shrink, so it's waterproof. So it actually has a glue that helps seal. So I try to use this whenever I can. Sometimes it's not possible, but yeah, it's good stuff. One cable done. Only took us like 16 hours. So our ground point on the engine is right here. Cable has a similar routing as the positive. Already got my cut line here. Now we just repeat. All right, here's the negative cable. Looking really good. So that means our battery cables are done.
Next up is wiring the ignition switch. For me, this is a part I typically modify like you see here, as I remove wiring I no longer have a need for. As I do not use park positions or CDI shutdown wiring for this specific bike, I simply desolder those connections, leaving me with a very simple 2-wire in and out setup. You don't need to go this far, it's just something I like to do. I then solder on a larger gauge wire on the output side of the switch, again because I like to oversize wiring when possible and make extra work for myself. But we'll come back to the ignition switch here shortly.
So obviously we have a mess on the table here, and it doesn't look like we've done a whole lot, but this is a very tedious process. So I have already gone and kind of solidified the, let's say the alternator wiring, the field coil, the oil pressure switch, and then the neutral switch. So I've kind of consolidated those, and I have those going up to a series of plugs right there. And then I've also taken the regulator rectifier and I've been working on rerouting, rerunning wires into their own connectors and kind of getting those in the right direction. And this is just very tedious because you have to think like 50 steps ahead. So for serviceability, you have to be able to remove the plug from where you're working. So assuming you have a chain and sprocket right here, I have to be able to slide this plug up through this gap. So we have to make sure that we use plugs that are smaller than that gap. And then as far as flow, like how the lower sections are going to turn into the actual harness. So right now I'm facing challenges with the ignition switch. I have 2 wires there, one of which goes to the solenoid, and then the other one will run up all the way to the X21 up top. And then there's also a red wire off of the regulator rectifier right back here that goes to the other side of the solenoid. The wire is only this long. I really don't want to put a junction in that, but I have to. Otherwise, the actual plug here is part of the regulator rectifier, and we can't be having that. So whiteboards, you can see, we referenced the whiteboard before, but these things are very handy because I always draw out my diagrams and just try to make sense, make heads and tails of everything, and get an idea of where my connectors are going to be, how everything is going to work, and go from there. So you also want to make sure you have good diagrams in front of you. Can't have too much information. So it's amazing how messy wiring gets. I've got that bench taken over. I've got half of that bench taken over. And of course this. We'll get there though. Now what I just demonstrated with the ignition switch is actually a Deutsch connector and a crimper. So this is actually something new I've been trying, and with every bike I try to do everything a little bit different, try to keep up on my skills as I've said. So this is actually the first time I'm using the Deutsch style. I bought a whole Deutsch connector kit, and then I was actually contacted by iWis or iCrimp about these tools. It was perfect timing because I was wanting to try that anyway. So I've been using these, and this is actually a really cool system. So one thing I'm trying to get over is the lack of strain relief on the sheathing of the wire after you insert your terminal. Now that's because once you insert it into the connector, the silicone boot over here, or the jacket, is actually what is the strain relief. It sits in there about that far. But it's a really cool system. It's waterproof, and these crimpers are pretty dang awesome. So I am enjoying them so far. Now I've been using these on the 14 to like 18 gauge wires. They do go down to smaller sizes, but I don't have the right terminals. And when I'm doing like 20 gauge and stuff like that, I like to use a smaller connector than a Deutsch. So I've been using like JWPMs and stuff, which are also weatherproof. But yeah, I've been really enjoying these. So basically, as you see, you got your terminal, insert it into the back, put your wire in after you get it cut to the right length so it doesn't have anything sticking out, and then just give it and you're done. So it's a really sturdy connection. And then once finished, you just kind of insert it into the connector. And then there is a lock that you put in here, but yeah, this kit that I've got works really well. I haven't had to de-pin anything yet, but I'm sure I will during this process. So yeah, just wanted to kind of point that out. And also just thank you to iCrimp for these tools. As you saw previously, I used the iWis battery cable crimper. I bought that one a couple years ago, as I said, and that thing has been great. Okay, so this is our ignition switch wiring, as you can see. So one wire has to come out, and this is going into the solenoid. So this is our main power into the ignition switch. And then this wire here is what goes up to the harness and into the X21 as our keyed power. So this is the first wire that we have in our harness. So this is going to start determining the overall layout. But for this, I need a 1/4 inch female terminal. And for this, I'm going to use these from iCrimp. That looks really good. And that is a nice crimp. And we're going to put these on the top 2 posts as I demonstrated earlier. So this is the beginning of our harness. And my next order of business is going to be working on the regulator rectifier wires. These are the last 2 that I have to terminate up top. So this red wire right here is actually coming from the regulator rectifier and sending power at this terminal. So this is powering the rest of the bike. Then this is going to be the sensing wire that is going to run up to the X21 pin, basically along with this wire. So this is going to get tied back into the harness and do the same kind of loop. All right, we have our power in and our power out on top of the solenoid here. So this is going to be one of the trigger wires. And we will continue building up this harness. All right, we are making some serious headway here. And where does this leave us? Well, we have most everything down below this level wired. So, of course, everything in this area was very tightly condensed, which is what I wanted. So we got to actually accomplish a lot of things on our list. And as of now, we have quite a bundle of wires that have actually made their way up to the tray. So looking at this red wire, this is going to be our X21 main power feed. And this is coming from the ignition switch. The yellow wire, I did have to add that one. This is actually a constant hot that will go to the X21 itself. The Plus model actually takes a constant hot, and that's going to be to like run things like your memory for your gauges and stuff like that. We also have the black sensing wire, which is coming from the regulator rectifier. So that's 3 right there. These 2 wires, the purple and then the yellow with green stripe, these are our solenoid trigger wires. So that's going to tell the solenoid to collapse, which will start the bike. And then these 2 right here, the purple and gray, these are going to be our oil pressure and our neutral signal, which is going to come up to the X21. So basically I did all of that to kind of have everything conveniently placed and start laying out our harness, that kind of thing. So we're ready to move on to the next steps. Now, as far as next steps for me, I do need to run another ground wire from this. I'm probably going to run it straight down and hook into our common ground point, which I've made down there. And that will just be an extension of that harness, kind of its own runner. So let's go over to our list and see where we're at. Now, of course, we have our 5 sections that I wanted to focus on. So we're breaking this down into chunks, which is the main thing. We don't want to get overwhelmed. So we started out with power distribution, as I said, got the battery done. Right next to our battery was the starter solenoid. So we ran the big starter cable lugs and everything. So we ran power to and from the starter solenoid. That starter solenoid has our main fuse built in. We ran our power to and from the ignition switch. So that finishes this entire section off. Now coming over here to the charging system, the regulator rectifier we saw was actually mounted very close, so that meant we got to work on that as well. So the stator rotor, we do have that wired up. And then our regulator rectifier, you saw we ran the wiring down to that, and then we also ran our grounds and powers, and then we have our field coil, which I mentioned. So this thing is actually completed. So of course these are 2 of the same. So our charging system is done too. Now we could work on ignition, we could work on our control inputs, and we can work on our outputs. So next up, I think I want to work on our control inputs. Now these are going to be things that are going to be giving a signal to the X21. So things like your rear brake switch is going to be an independent item. We have our neutral switch as well as our oil pressure switch, which you saw we already ran. That's the purple and gray wire. Since we're already down there in this area, we went ahead and just completed them and ran them up. So we've already kind of started working on a few things here, but let's go ahead and start working on the rest. Now, of course, I mentioned we already have our oil pressure switch ran. Our neutral is way back here. Those wires have been ran up, and that is going to be our gray and purple up here. The next one I wanted to work on will be the rear brake switch. So that mounts right here. We have our spring that runs down. And I want to work on this because that is going to be a section of wire that will run up along this same loom so we can continue to make it look good. Now the switch itself is actually the original unit. I went ahead and tested to make sure the functionality is working, and then because I don't want a plug down in this area, I clipped off the stock ends and then I've soldered on some very small 22 gauge wiring. This does not need to be any substantial gauge wiring because there's no real current passing through this. It's just a signal wire for the X21. So what I've done here, of course, I've added that wiring. This will mount like that, and then this flows right up along the same path. So that will look good. Now up on our bars, we have the controls. The left side is actually going to work just fine how it's intended to be mounted with the button on the low side that's on the front. That's doable, but on the right side here, the button that would be on the front side, normally it's positioned on the bottom, but what I'm finding is that it's going to interfere with the master cylinder and it's just very hard to reach. You have to kind of go over the throttle housing and stuff like that. So what I want to do is actually reposition this switch, and I've already done that. I've simply flipped it upside down. There are 2 reliefs on the housing itself to kind of run your wire out of either side. Now, this does make the wire come out of the top, and I just have it draped down the front of the bar, and it looks pretty clean, and once we put some loom on it, it'll look totally fine. So on the right side, we have our green wires. This is for your brake switch, so we will wire those up to the brake switch on the master cylinder in due time. Our cable itself doesn't look like I will have to change the length at all. I think it's going to actually run pretty well right where we need it to. Because I'm not completely set on these bars, I won't know until I really ride this bike. I'm not going to internally wire them just yet. So that's always an option I can do in the future. I've shown how to do that in my CB750 videos, opening up a slot here and a slot here, running the wires through. Makes it really clean, it's nice. But we are going to have to make a little bit of an adjustment to this end of the wire. So let me kind of break that down for you right now. Now this little plug in front of you is for the right bar control. And if you look, we have 5 wires total. Now I've mentioned this is a ground-based system. So this black wire is our ground, and this is the common wire. And what the system is looking for is as you press a button, which one has continuity to ground. So you can actually test to see which wire is to which button. So we're gonna actually have to reverse one or two of these to actually move the turn signal or the start button, like to get them back into the correct orientation on the front of the control, because we flipped the control upside down. So basically we're just gonna be swapping two wires on this side and we should be good to go. All right, so right now I have my test leads here. I have this on continuity. So what I'm going to do, we'll put one on the ground side, and as an example, just do the red wire. I'm going to press a button. Okay, so the red wire, that's going to be for the brake switch. So I'm going to move over here to yellow. Okay, so as of now, this is the top button, but normally that would be the bottom button. So we know that yellow needs to get swapped to the bottom, and I'm assuming green is going to be now the bottom button, which we have to go to the top. Yes. So what we have to do is actually depin the yellow and the green, and we're going to flip-flop these. And that will have our button housing in the correct orientation, just flipped upside down. And of course, don't tell NWT I'm showing you guys how to do this stuff. It's just, I go the extra mile, okay? I'm trying to give you guys good, solid information on how to make subtle tweaks to make it just right for you. Okay, as mentioned, we need to swap green and yellow. So just on top here, there's a little slit. There's a tang that you can push down very gently. These don't take much force. So we're gonna kind of get a hold of one of the wires here. Sorry for my grubby fingers. I just got done working on a Cadillac doing some control arm bushings. Just depress that. And that comes out. There's the tiniest of tangs. There's no way I could even capture that on camera. Same thing for the yellow. Okay, and now we flip-flop them. And that should work just like factory. So that's kind of the magic of the ground-based system right there, is just really how elegant it is. It really eliminates a lot of wiring, and you know, with a momentary button, it makes it really easy. Now what I've done here is taped up the actual harness to the bar, and we're just trying to see how much length we have. We're testing out routing. Right here there's actually a cable guide that's here from the factory. So we're just running our cable along where we think it's going to go into the tray itself. And honestly, this thing is the absolute perfect length. So no adjustments needed there. So that's about the furthest I can pull it back. And that's not really with any slack built into the handlebars when you turn them, so you would need a little bit more on this side. I've got a little bit more right here. So what that's gonna mean is, you know, we're gonna have to move the X21 forward just a hair to get away with it. But we will find out what that happy medium is. Now, of course, we have a little bit more length on our left side because, you know, we don't have to travel quite as far. But we could easily kind of take some slack out, you know, like that. Do a little loop in here. It's not worth cutting and re-terminating everything. So this gets us close. So back over here on the left side, this is the clutch switch wiring. Now we're just going to be using like a basic MGO clutch perch with no switch built in. So the way you bypass the clutch switch is actually going to be to just tie them together. Now these are real built into the control, so what we're going to do is do a little crimp splice connector right here. We'll just tuck that into the housing, cover it with some heat shrink, and it will be good to go. So it's going to be a real easy patch. I'm going to cut that. These are about a 20 gauge. Do one of these. Bada bing, bada boom. Now you can of course attach these two wires any way you feel fit. If you want to strip them back a little bit further, twist them together, do some heat shrink, whatever. If you want to solder them, it's all good. Just do what you want. Now for this, I'm using a little splice crimp connector. And I'm pairing that with some double barrel crimpers here. I know this is gonna be a little tough to see. Yeah, we need to strip off quite a bit actually. I'm fully aware this video is going to be at least an hour and a half long. And I'm not going to apologize because we're packing this full of info. The nitty gritty, the real deal stuff. So we're going overkill on this thing. I've twisted it together and then I've looped it back so it has a little bit more mass to it. Get set up here. Boom. That is a really good crimp. That is going nowhere. So I'm going to put a little piece of heat shrink over that and then we will tuck it in here and it'll be good. And then you guys know this is adhesive lined heat shrink, so it has like a glue inside. Get that hot, pinch her together, and that's sealed off. And now, just tuck it inside. And that is a bypassed clutch switch. So of course, bypassing the clutch switch is pretty normal. I do this on almost all of my bikes. And as you see in this instance, we just don't have a switch on the housing. So this is what we're doing. If you leave those detached, you might have trouble starting the bike. All right, moving on to the brake switch. This one's pretty straightforward. So this includes the terminals that you need, but before we put those on, I'm just going to install a little bit of loom to run back up here into the control. Okay, I like that placement. This is where we take advantage of all the scraps of heat shrink that we have. Just gonna put that up there for now. This is gonna get tight. Now for a wire this small going into this style terminal, what I'm going to do is strip off a little extra, do a twist, fold it back, it builds up a little bit more size. You guys are going to be able to see that at all. I'm going to load my terminal in here. And a perfect crimp. So we can slide the jacket forward. That side's done. Lather, rinse, repeat. So for this, I'm actually going to get these plugged in first, and then I'm going to heat shrink this. There Go. Okay. All right, we have clean routing. That looks good. I like it. All right, back to our board. Okay, now that we have the controls wired, which is really the easy part, that knocks out your like headlight signals, kill switch, horn, and brakes. You saw we did the rear brake switch. So that is all of our control inputs. So we're gonna cross all of that out. So outputs, we are going to start on this, and this is probably, if I had to say, probably the most stressful part is trying to understand exactly how to run these wires. So it's not overly complicated. This is just going to require thinking many steps ahead. So that's something we're going to tackle now. Onto the bike here. I don't know if I had mentioned the orientation of the X21 before, but we have landed on the orientation I'm going to stick with. So I have my outputs on this side. And so that's all of these screw terminals right there. And then my inputs are on this side along with the handlebar controls, which I have moved over to that side. No real difference in routing. So this is going to make the most sense for the overall flow of the harness. As you've seen, I've ran basically all of my inputs and power distribution stuff from the bottom half of the bike. So most of that is just going to go to like right here. And then we have this bundle of wires here that will incorporate some of these. There's going to be two wires here, the yellow with green and the purple. That's for the starter solenoid. These are going to be the only outputs we have over on this side. So I will find a way to cleanly route them either around that way or go around there. We'll see how it looks. But with that being said, it's time to start running our outputs. So this is going to be where we have to start thinking like 40 steps ahead, something like that, to kind of determine the layout of the harness. Now, some things to consider. We need to think about serviceability. So let's say you have to take the harness off the bike or take a component off the bike. What that means is you need to have a plug, and that plug needs to be accessible. And the location of that plug, like if I was to put, let's say, a plug right here, it can't be any bigger than that hole, because if you got to take it out, well, you got to depin it, and that's an extra pain in the butt. So you have to think about these things, trying to make it all kind of flow. So this is going to be a relatively simple layout because I have most everything down there, but still, we need to kind of think about how we're going to be making this flow. So we'll start running some of the outputs like to the headlight, the turn signals, and then we'll have like some gauge outputs and stuff like that. And then we'll be able to kind of see how we need to branch it and where our joints are going to be and how it's going to all have to be loomed. So it's just, I don't know, it's just something you have to figure out. It's challenging, but this is where you make it look good. So over here on the table, I have already started cutting wire up for my outputs. So we're going to start getting these on the bike. Now they're all going to be cut long, and then we'll work on cutting them short once we get them on the bike and know exactly where to cut, where we're going to put our plugs and things like that. All right, I've got a bundle of wires here. I have already kind of taped the corresponding ones to each other. So this is going to be my front turn signals. Okay, first up, pink wire. This is going to be our ignition output. So I know we're going to be running that through here. And this is going to end up going to our coils, which will mount right here. And then we'll also tie in the electronic ignition. So we'll be able to branch that wherever we need. So we'll just kind of gently set that in there. We have a gray, and then we have a black. So I've made these 16 gauge. It's a little oversized. You could definitely get away with 18. This is going to be for our horn. Our horn is mounted right here, so this is a shorter lead for sure. So I will run The gray back here and the black for our ground is going to be routed somewhere. We don't know where yet, but I will stick that right there. We have plenty of length. Okay, our front turn signals. Put a little tape on this just to kind of hold it together while we're going. Next up, our headlight. Black for ground, white for low beam, blue for high beam. Real simple. So I'm going to run the low and the high back to the X21. The ground wire is going to kind of stay this side of the tray, and the rest of it goes forward and into the bucket itself. So pink for ignition, blue for high beam, green for left or right turn signal, yellow for left or right turn signal, gray for horn, white for low beam. Over here we have our purple and our yellow with green stripe. That's going to be our starter solenoid. So basically we have a couple brake wires to come out of here. And then that's pretty much it. The gauge output harness is going to be an entire separate thing. So right now I'm going to kind of work on starting to get the flow here. All right, we got some wires ran, and the next step is to work on the gauge outputs. And that is going to be this little loom right here. This is supplied by NWT for the X21 kit, and it's going to go right there. And all of that will run forward along the bike to, of course, our gauge harness. So we got all this right there. Now this part can be pretty tricky because now is when we're going to start kind of combining a aftermarket wire color diagram with another aftermarket wire color diagram. And so this is going to get a little complicated because you might have gray going to green and green going to purple, and who knows. So I have a diagram drawn out and I'll show you guys how I did it. All right, on the table here I have the instructions for the gauge itself. So with every gauge you get, they should be providing you a diagram, so showing you exactly what wire color goes to what output, that kind of thing. And so this gauge, we need a constant hot, we need a switched power, like everything. You have an output for your ignition signal, you need an input for your turn signals, and then there are other options beyond that. So to pair with that, we need to go to our diagram for the X21. Now this is for a basic unit, so this actually has less wiring than what I'm actually doing. I have that diagram pulled up on my phone, so I can put up a screenshot now of kind of the difference that might have. So using that information, the color codes from here, and then the color codes from here, we can go to the board over here, and this is just another reason I really love whiteboards, because I can draw this stuff out. I'm a visual person. So right here we have the X21. This red band represents that red piece of heat shrink, just so I don't get it all confused. And so we have the color codes that we're going to be using coming out of the X21. I do have some extras on here that we're not going to be utilizing. I'll talk about those in a few. But you can see here, like as an example, I have green. That's going to go to white from the gauge, and that's for the right turn signal. Our purple is going to go to the gray, which is for oil pressure on the gauge. Our gray then goes to purple, so like that's a very confusing thing right there. but that's for the neutral. So you got to imagine not every manufacturer is going to stick to the same exact wire color code, which can be very confusing. But we have everything lined out here, so we're going to follow this visual diagram. And then the gauge itself, it also has a fuel and a hazard function that we're not going to utilize. So we'll have two wires coming off the gauge that we're not going to use. So for now, I can go ahead, unbundle this. We'll separate out the wires that we're going to use, and we'll start routing those frontwards. Okay, we're going to go ahead and do our tape here. And of course, we're going to lay a bundle of wires down. It's important, don't get overwhelmed. We're just doing one piece at a time. So that's a nice loom right there. So of course this, we're just going to go ahead and plug it in. That way it'll be easier to hold. I'm going to start running these all through this hole. Now if you're working with an X21, what you don't want to do is go pulling on the wire. So if you need to make adjustments, I always try to have a little bit of inward force. That way you're not pulling pins out. You just have to be really careful. And then whenever you go to remove these, you want to use the push tab and actually pull from the connector. Don't pull from the wiring. Now from here, what I want to do is start separating out the wires that I will plan on using, and then the auxiliary wires that are part of the plus system. We'll kind of separate those and have a dedicated branch to where if somebody wanted to wire in an accessory on the bike, they have that ability. So I know we're going to use the purple. We're going to use the red. Going to use the gray. Bear with me, I have short-term memory loss. As you can see here, I'm just using my phone. I have all of these pulled up. So our yellow, black is ground, red's key power, green is our right indicator, orange is battery switched 12, brown is our backlight, which I'm not entirely sure if we have to use because our switch 12 is actually going to power the lights on the gauges. So I'll keep this as like a intermediate. We might need to use it, we might not. This dark blue is of course the high indicator, and then white is technically sensor 1, pink is sensor 2. We're not using those. And then this guy right here is actually going to be for the tachometer. So just trying to pull these things back. Okay. And then these guys, we'll simply branch these out and leave them with plenty of length, and then if somebody wants to add on in the future, they can. All right, now in front of us we have the actual roadmap for the gauge itself. The harness for the gauge we need to go through. So our light blue and our dark blue right here, we're not going to be using. That is for our fuel and our hazard lights. So that means we can kind of like clip the ends off of that, and we'll just kind of like tuck them away. We'll cover them in heat shrink. We'll make sure they don't get used. And then that leaves us with, I think, approximately 9 wires. So 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Now, of course, this gauge came with its own plug. Now, these are a 110 style. These are very common. I have everything I need to actually recreate that terminal section on the end of that, but because I'm me, I want to go with a cleaner solution. So I'm going to go with a JWPM. This is like a really small silicone jacket, weatherproof setup. This is something you would actually also find on other gauges. So that's actually kind of where I found these originally. But what that means is I'm going to actually have to cut the ends off of this section of terminals, and we're going to have to repin it for that. But it ultimately will be a cleaner setup to get it back into this harness here. So I am very happy to go with that. But be warned, if you do something like that, you could potentially void the warranty because you run the risk of, pinning these things out wrong. So you do take on a little bit of liability with that, but I like a risk. Now back over here on the actual X21 harness, after going through the diagrams, this brown wire, which I've mentioned before, this in the X21 land is actually for the gauge backlight power. Now the red wire is essentially the same thing. So depending on how you wire your gauges or what type of gauges you have, you might need to utilize a separate function here and run the red wire to power either like your neutral light or something like that. So you have flexibility here. For us, we're only going to be utilizing the red wire as our switched 12. So I'm just going to kind of back out this brown wire altogether, and we'll run it alongside the other ones that we're not using. So we won't get rid of it, but we will keep it as a, you know, just if you need it on a rainy day or something like that. So that's good. We have 9 wires here and 9 wires here that we have to tap into. So we're gonna go ahead and figure out the combination of connectors that we need, maybe a 6 and a 3, and we'll go from there. Okay, what I'm gonna do is put the power side of things all in one plug. That's gonna be these 3 wires. Our red, black for ground, brown for constant hot. Now the terminals I'm working with, these like JWPMs, these are super tiny, okay? So I'm gonna do the male side of the connector. So we have male terminals in here. So first what I do is I pick out this little silicone insulator. And me personally, I put these on the wires first. Helps hold them in place, and then once I'm done, I insert it. Maximum concentration required. Okay. And of course, guys, you do not have to go this far with it. If this is your first time building a wiring harness, I really don't want you guys to feel pressured to think that you have to go to this level, because you do not. And then there are some of you out there who can do this in their sleep much, much faster than I can. And I applaud you. I can't tell you how much of a love-hate relationship it is to do wiring. There we go. And these have the faintest little positive connection sound to them. And then I pop the jacket back in. And that is one done. All right, our gauge wiring is done on the gauge side. So at some point we will match on this side. With the, we'll call it the red loom. So the red section ran basically all the way up to the gauges. You guys saw I terminated all of these. So we're not going to terminate the harness side just yet, because we have to determine how everything's going to lay out first, because it's very important for final like looming and things like that. So right now though, I want to turn my attention to the blue side. Now the blue connector here, we'll call that. This one actually has wires that we've pretty much already ran. So the brake switch will go here for the rear brake switch, the oil pressure, the neutral signal, those kind of go back into here. Now, the way they sell this is meant to be like, you know, spliced in just to make it easier. But because I'm a crazy person, I have the terminals for these. So I'm actually going to kind of remake this plug. So I'll depin the ones that I'm going to remake that are going to run from up here basically. And then the rest of these will run to where they go. Now, this has a lot of options. I've mentioned on the output side, we have like auxiliary functions. that we're not going to be utilizing. So basically the, like pink and black and white and green and stuff like that, there's 4 wires in here that we're not going to be utilizing. We're going to leave those long and run them and just have them kind of hanging out over here. Same kind of deal with these guys. And so if you ever wanted to tap into those in the future and add something on, you could do that. And then one more thing of note, there is a wire in here that is not in focus. So within this sub harness, you can see right here, that's a yellow with green wire. There's also a yellow with green in this side. Now, this yellow with green has to run up and get a tack signal. So that's mandatory for the X21 Plus for the starter anti-grind, and also for it to output the signal to your actual gauge, to your actual tachometer. So I'm going to be running 2 of the same color along the same plane here until we depart where the pink wire is. So it's just going to be very important that I don't get these mixed up. Okay, this is some of the stuff that keeps me up at night, and that is wire routing. Okay, this is where it gets pretty complicated in that you have to think like 50 steps ahead. So we know that we have to take two wires from this harness section that comes up from the bottom of the bike, and we have to run them over here to our output side for the solenoid. Okay, that's a pretty easy branch to make, and it doesn't have to actually conjoin into this section of harness. So there is another wire, the yellow with green stripe, which is going to be in here somewhere, that's coming from the blue plug we just talked about. That is actually the only wire that needs to run to the front of the bike up to the ignition. The rest of them are just going right down here, as I've shown you guys many times. So how do we run that one wire? Do we loop it around here and then put a plug right here and make it part of this harness? Or do we just run it as an individual wire that goes on its own and go up this side of the frame and then just, I don't know, have a plug up there by the coil or something where it ties in? I think it's probably going to be cleaner to run it as an individual wire, but yeah, it doesn't mean I like it. So I guess it'll make sense because we have all of these wires, and you can barely see this. But I guess since we have all of these wires, which we're not using, we can run it along the same path and just run it past this. So I guess that's what we're gonna do. Now, what gets more complicated now is we're to the point where we have to start looming things. So I have to put a plug in for my brake switch, which is right here, because I have to be able to unplug the switch should I need to remove it. So there's going to be a little short section of harness that's tied in right here at the blue plug that goes to the brake switch plug here. And then from there, for me to terminate anything, it really doesn't make sense because everything is terminated down below. So what that means is I have to start adding loom from this side, moving it down below, completing that whole bottom side of the harness, and then we're going to start building up. So to complete this, we have to start looming everything, as I said. And that's going to start getting complicated because then that means we have to really make a determination for where our turn is for the solenoid wiring, and that's going to also have a dictation on how we do heat shrink and all of that stuff. Again, this is the stuff that keeps me up at night. It's just thinking like 50 steps ahead on this. It's just complicated. All right, I just pulled the main harness assembly from the bottom of the bike. So this is everything that we worked towards on getting, like a regulator rectifier, the solenoid, the ignition switch, that kind of thing, and then our oil pressure and neutral switch. So I've already started adding a little bit of loom on the harness. We have to feed it from the top side and then down. So we have to work from your furthest extremity back up. So it's going to be a little tricky. We're going to have some short pieces of loom in maybe this area here. And then we have to kind of have the ground wire run in, and it's part of it. It's complicated. So I'm going to try to slowly release tension on stuff, not lose the position of the wiring, and try to tidy this up a little bit and start working our way up. Once we get past this point, it's cake. All right, here is the plug for the neutral and oil, which we just did a section of loom on. That comes up to right here. That is that Nymex I'm talking about. So as of right here, you can see the ground wire, which comes out of the harness about the same spot. So that's going to be another part of the same branch. And then this section over here, running to the other extremities, we have to work on covering this first. And then off the same general branch, we have the rest of the harness. So what I'm going to do for this is I'm going to cover this section with heat shrink alone, because it doesn't make sense to do like this short of a section of Nymex or something like that. So I will just do heat shrink on this section alone. That will bring me back into this general vicinity. From there, we will then have Nymex covering the entire loom section, running all the way up, and then we'll have to determine where it's going to start splitting off. So we're going to have to do this on the bike. I'm going to go ahead and kind of mount this back on. That way it's all in shape. So whenever we do the heat shrink, it kind of holds the harness in the shape where the bends are and stuff, and it makes it a lot easier. So then once we get up here, all of this will be in one loom, but doing branches is a little tricky at first. You get the hang of it though. Here, we'll use this. Bread ties. I usually save a lot of these, but I have no idea where they're all at right now, so I only have a few. But bread ties are fantastic for wiring. There's your tech tip. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and lay this back into the bike, and from there we can start doing our heat shrink. And guys, I'm well aware this is the most boring video ever, but if you want information and you want to know how to do this stuff, you got to sit through some boring shit sometimes. If you guys can see, my heat shrink ends about right there. This is the second piece that goes over the branches, so this is going over other pieces of heat shrink. And that is sealed down here, and now we have to slide our Nymex down and fit it within this, and then we're basically going to end the Nymex about right here, and then just start our branches. I think that'll be the cleanest solution. So we'll have a couple that go to the blue connector, the yellow, and the green, and like, you know, all the power distribution and stuff. So this is the part where it starts looking pretty tidy. And doing Nymex is just generally, it's a pain in the butt. You know, there's no two ways about it. And any little jagged edge you have on the end of your wires is really going to fight you when you go to try to feed this stuff on. If you've never wired a bike before, don't try to use this stuff. You will go crazy. Okay, that's all of our wires fed in. One tough part with this is how it does fray, and it's very difficult to actually cut. Using a lighter doesn't exactly do any good for you either. All right, that section of harness will sit quietly right there, tucked behind the frame, and get ran up here. Okay, like I mentioned, this stuff keeps me up at night, so as you can see here, I've got heat shrink laying out. So I have finally determined how the branch is going to look. So tying in our blue connector into the rest of the harness that we already have ran down here. You can see here I have two pieces of heat shrink on the same section of loom with one break in the middle. And that is to both tie in the purple and gray coming up from one harness and then tie it into this section, and then also allow the rest of the loom, which is down here, to run up that way. So I have all of this heat shrink, and it'll all be kind of like ran at the same approximate length. Over that, I will have another piece of heat shrink, which is down over here. So we have to get all of it loaded on beforehand. And then of course our loom is right here. So the heat shrink will cover the loom on that side. These will be extending out, kind of sealing the wires, making it look good. And then I have another piece of heat shrink for this section that's, I think it's like up here. So that will cover everything. But let me tell you, this was a pretty tricky one. Thinking so far in advance. I totally forgot to cut it to length. Okay. Dingus move. Let's try that again. Okay. Attempt number 2. Now the red with black is going to be a little bit tricky because I'm going to tie both of these together into one connector. Okay, that's this entire side of the loom completed. I'm going to get this heat shrink down, make sure it seats in there exactly how I want. and that all of these are at the same length because I'm picky. Now that I'm getting some of the wires down, it's getting hard to keep this thing in place, so I'm going to actually adhere it down. Now this thing comes with some adhesive pads, some double-sided tape basically, and that works fine. I prefer to use Velcro so I can remove this thing at will and move things around. So I generally do it this way, and it has always worked out for me. And we shouldn't have to move this thing anymore, but should we need to remove it, we can. So now that I have this entire side completed, I'm gonna start working on my outputs. So first I want to tin these 16 gauge solenoid wires. So I've got a little rosin flux on there already. And I have these mushroomed out ever so slightly. And then from here, I've already marked the solenoid positive, which is the purple wire. Feed that in, and then the negative side. There we go. All right. All right, we're looking good up there. So next up on the list, we're continuing with the output side of things. So I need to start terminating the headlight, the turn signals, and of course the gauge. We've already done the gauge. And the placement of the connectors was just determined by that's how much harness we had. But we have options on everything else. So right here I have a Deutsch connector kind of placed where I think I'm going to want it. So you have to imagine our coils are right here. We already have a couple plugs laying underneath that. So right here is going to be a nice convenient spot to start laying a couple more plugs. So this is just a 3-pin unit, and this is going to be for the headlight. So what I'm going to do is terminate the headlight side to about right there. And then I need to start working on my front turn signals, and I'll basically be doing the same thing. So we're going to have a sort of branch, so I'll probably put 2 more connectors right here, one for either side of the turn signals, and then I will branch them because we're gonna have a common ground, and pretty much that's it. So they'll start here, they'll split off into their own 2 plugs, and then from there we'll have 2 individual leads running up the bike. So it's looking like about right here is where I will start having another branch. I know we spent a lot of time on this one, but I think for this branch, almost all of them are going to be going the same way. Now, the only complication we're going to have, we need to figure out how to tie in our rear run, turn, brake system. So those wires come in right here. So we're going to tie the grounds together and the running / brake light, and that output's right here, but we need to kind of tie that into the front somehow. So we will tie the 2 black wires together for the ground, and then we'll also tie the red wires for these lights, which is going to be the run and brake. So those are just going to go to an output here. We'll probably route it like cleanly back here and then turn it around. That way all of these are coming out the same direction, because I'm picky. And then the turn signals are going to be a little bit more tricky because I want to tie those in to the front turn signals. So again, I'll probably run those down and then maybe like do a splice connection and then turn it back around, and that way they're all just on one wire and it just looks extra clean. But we will have a connector about right here. That way we can unplug them, depin them if we ever need to try to remove these things, which is going to be an absolute nightmare, but I designed it that way. It's okay. All right, I have the ground, the low beam, and the high beam. That's the approximate location of the pins, so we're just going to start cutting. So now I can go ahead and terminate these things, and we'll start working on looming it for the rest of the side. All right, for these we're going to put on a female Deutsch connector plug, so easy enough. So a little bit more. We need a little less. Sounds good. Now that we know our length. Seriously, these things are awesome. I will put my ground at the bottom. This really doesn't matter. Like that. And that is done. So now it's time to kind of work our way forward. We're making some progress here getting the rest of our wires laid out. So we have our orange wire, which is going to be the running light and brake light. So this section here is going to go to the actual X21. And then I have my turn signal slash taillight wiring completed here. And I have a sub harness ran back to the front of the loom, or about midpoint of the bike, just because I want to make connections up there, which run back here, instead of trying to make like some weird unattractive thing in the back. So if you look closely, I've got an orange and an orange. So I have my color codes with my yellow and green for the corresponding sides. These are going to be the same, of course. But over here, I have made a splice connection for all three. Like I said, we're running them from the signals to about here, and then we make a new connection, like you see. And then that's just running forward to the X21. So it outputs over here and then goes back. So pretty simple. And then I'm going to do the same thing with my turn signals. So these are just left and right. I'll go ahead and work on the fronts. We'll kind of find our midpoint here, and then we'll make our connections, and that'll be good. So it'll be the same kind of thing. We'll have a splice about in the middle, one from either end, and then one going back to the X21. So that'll be pretty simple. So we'll just have a few 3-wire splices. I'm getting ready to cover this in some heat shrink to protect it, and we'll move on to the next thing.
Starting in here, which is not good. There's that original yellow.
All right, cruising right along here. I'm starting to consolidate the grounds from the taillight side. So of course we have 2 rear taillight slash turn signals. Each light has its own ground. So I have both of those running up, and those are coming down here. Now, same kind of thing for the front. We have 2 grounds coming back. So that would be these 2 guys here. And originally I just ran a long ground from one side, and then it's running up to here. So basically I want to consolidate all 5 of these wires. Now, these 3 wires will come together as one big ground. I think I'm going to use this tab here. The fact that I'm kind of routing everything there already, I should probably use that spot. But anyway, we're going to use another splice connector. So do what you got to do. If you want to use like a butt connector or something like that, just go ahead and do that. But I have these. I prefer them. It's kind of factory, and it's very clean when done. So we'll have 2 wires on one side and then 3 on the other. So again, we'll hide this connection kind of within the loom, and you'll never see it. And we'll just have one branch going over here to our main grounds. So I'm going to go ahead and get this set up. It will not be easy to kind of get everything situated, but then we'll complete it. We'll throw some heat shrink over it and be done. Well, I've made a change, and I was just talking about those grounds. So what I have done, I decided to move them this way for a couple reasons. I feel like this stud right here, after I cleaned off metal to this tab, that might be a better ground point in general. And then also having a branch go in 2 different directions, so some facing that way and some facing that way, really complicates the looming process and makes it just less attractive. So since none of them were connected, I was able to just kind of like flip one of them 180 and then run it back up here, and then flip another one 180, and it was actually really simple, so no big deal. And I think that's going to be a lot more aesthetically pleasing. So down here it's all nice and tidy. You can see there I probably had like 1 loop built in. So not a big deal. But now that means we are on to the looming process. So I'm going to start with this piece here and that big piece of heat shrink. So we'll get it loomed from about here back to here. That's going to make it look a lot better. And then from that point, we have our branches to go ahead and loom and heat shrink. And from there, we're just making our final connections to our ignition system, the turn signals, and then the headlight. So, well, and the horn. So it's really like, I mean, we're in the home stretch right now, guys. All right, you guys can see I made all of my connections over here. So from here back, we are done. So that's all you'll see in this tray. Came out really clean, really happy with it. Up here, I did move the harness on top this bar just because I didn't want it hanging down here. I did check with the tank on, you wouldn't see it anyway, but this works just fine. So I'll also move this side above the bar too. Plenty of space below the tank. So now we're gonna actually start making our final connections here. So we have our ground wires consolidated. We have to put those to that stud there. Our headlight wiring is right here. We already have that plug we've terminated down there. This is going to be for the horn and the ignition power. So probably run some loom up about, maybe about this high, and then we can run the horn straight over, and that will plug in right there. The ignition, it's going to be pretty easy. We'll just make a jumper harness to go to the coils. Down here we have our gauge wiring. So pretty self-explanatory. We talked about all that, so I'll just make the terminations there. Over here we have our left and right front turn signals. So we have 2 grounds and then our left-right signal power. And then this is going to be the 3 wires that we can just have as, you know, save them for rainy day. These are like the auxiliary controls. And then also the brown, which is the backlight power for the gauge, which we don't have to use. So we're just going to kind of terminate these. We'll put some heat shrink over them, give them a little loop, tie them up to the frame. It won't look the cleanest, but it doesn't have to. So after that, we'll go ahead and terminate this side and everything is going to look awesome. Bam! After some heat shrink, we have all of the branches, at least on this section, completed. So everything is terminated on the branch side. So now I can actually move that piece of heat shrink forward. We'll move that Nymex forward. We'll complete this section right here, and then all we got to do is actually terminate it. It's going to start looking real good. Now I should be putting the edge of the heat shrink about right here. So I'm actually going to clamp this down. I'll get another zip tie on this. That way the heat shrink can clamp down as, or shrink down as hard as possible. And yeah, when I'm wiring, I go through a lot of zip ties. It's just, you just gotta, I just do it, you know. right there. Actually, I want to get some of this loom forward a little bit, so I'll try to get the Nymax in front of it. Like that. Oh, perfect. I'm telling y'all, I hate wiring as much as I love wiring. It's very difficult. While it's still warm, kind of get a little bend on it. Boom. That looks good.
As I start making the final terminations on this harness, I just want to remind all of you to take your time, go slow, and do one thing at a time. It's very easy to get overwhelmed with this, and even I have to take a ton of breaks throughout the build. I also want to reiterate that you do not need to do everything exactly like I'm doing. I try to do something different with each harness and push my skills, so just do what you feel comfortable with and use what wiring parts you have readily available. This video is to show you how I think through the process and less about using the coolest connectors or best tools, so don't let that distract you.
Alright, I just went through and filed that standoff to bare metal, so that's going to be a good ground point. So what I'm thinking here is I'll actually end up putting a stud through it that way, holding down the ground, and then we'll just kind of clip the horn onto it on that side. That way the priority for the clamp is on the ground side. Guys, we are getting so close to a test of this system. So everything is completed up here except for the ignition and the turn signals. Now, I'm gonna wait till I wire up the actual electronic ignition on this thing to complete the last ignition wiring. That's gonna be simple, okay? It's just like one power that's just spread across a couple things, and then 2 ground wires or signal wires to the actual coils. So again, very easy. What I can do right now though is go ahead and finish up the front turn signal wiring. So I've got my left and my right. So I'm going to kind of trim this back. I have the routing how I feel like I want it. And then you know what? We're gonna go ahead and hook up the battery and do a systems check of this thing. And I think it's gonna be awesome. So everything is coming out very nice. I am extremely pleased with the overall routing, the flow, and just accessibility. I mean, it looks like this is kind of bundled up behind the coils, but there's a ton of room. So it all fits really well in there. I should still very much be able to get a clutch cable and a throttle cable down through here. The clutch might just run kind of right along this channel and then to the inside of the tube where it goes down there. And then the throttle cable, that'll come down and be a central exit. So there's gonna be plenty of space for that. So I'm excited. For these connections, I'm going to go back to my JWPMs, and then, like I've mentioned before, we're going to go one male and one female. That way you can't plug them in backwards, and that just makes sense. So I'm going to finish these up. And just like that, I think we're ready for a systems check, which is pretty awesome. So big milestone right now. Now with any wiring harness build, before you get to this stage, you want to do a nice once over, make sure there's nothing that's going to be touching, no odd, short to grounds, anything like that. So as you know, this pink wire, that's for the ignition. That's not touching anything right now. So we're not going to use that. We're not going to use the starter. There's no oil in this thing. I basically want to check the lighting and that kind of stuff. We'll just do a basic check. And then we're also going to set the brightness of our taillights. So yeah, I'm going to remove the rec. We'll put the main fuse in it, and then I'll hook up the battery, and we should just be able to hit the key and see some action, and hopefully not smoke. Okay, we've got our 20 amp. It's gonna go right here. Okay, we'll go ahead and pull our tape off. We'll actually hook up the positive side first. All right. All right, let's hit the key. So, assuming everything goes well, we should see a triple flash pattern from the taillights, I believe, and then we'll start cycling through everything. So there we go. So that is very bright. These are some awesome lights. This is actually our running light. Let me check brake light function. There you go. Front brakes. Okay. Now, everything up here, we have basically ignition on, we have our start, and then we have our right turn signal. So we're just going to test right turn signal. So one tap. Works great. One tap off. Let's go left turn signal. That works great. I don't know. Behind this thing, these lights are like blinding. They're really, really good. So there's a lot of cheap options out there. These are actually from Purpose Built Moto. I'm so happy I went with them. So I'm actually going to turn down the brightness. The X21 unit actually uses the running light as a run brake. So it turns it into a dual filament. It limits the voltage on your running light, as you see here, and then allows basically full power whenever you go to brake. So I'm going to drop it down a little bit to kind of give a little bit more of a differentiation here. These things are seriously intense. Okay, that's all the way down. Okay, now if we do both turn signals at the same time, I believe they should just flash as like a hazard. So one tap. So it didn't quite get that one. Yeah, you notice they went into synchronous there. So this is like your flasher. And it's actually flashing on the dash as well, which is cool. So one tap. Now we should be back to just left signal. Cancel it by that. So we're good. These are awesome. Okay, we should, I think, triple tap to do our headlight on. So that's our soft start. So you notice it came up slowly. So we got our beam there. I think I do a double tap here to get it to high beam. There's our high beam. Double tap, back to low. All right. And then on our dash, we should see the high beam come up. Double tap. There's our indicator. Double tap down, triple tap off. Okay. Okay, well, we have to test the horn. It works. Horn works. So one thing I'm not seeing is the neutral indicator, which is strange, or the oil. So I need to look into that, figure out what's going on. Otherwise, I think we did just fine. All right, we've got oil in the engine right now. I have my ignition wired up. I don't have plug wires on it, but I would like to see if this thing actually rolls over. So I've got my paper towels out of the intake. I have no spark plugs in it, so it's not going to build any kind of compression or anything like that. So we will test our solenoid, see what happens. That's not good. Starter spinning. Why is it not rotating the engine? I rebuilt the starter clutch. Looks like it's not even grabbing anything. Like, I put the chain on, right? So as you see, I have the ignition system wired up, and the fact that the solenoid clicks does mean that that system works as well. Unfortunately, the starter clutch does not work, so I'm going to dig into that, but that's not wiring related. So hopefully you found this very informative. This is not necessarily about how to wire up like an X21 or an M unit or any particular system. It's rather about how I go about just making a wiring harness. So the things to consider, such as wire routing, the wire gauge you might need, the overall serviceability of it, how to tie things together, the order of operations for, say, heat shrink and loom, just a lot of different things. So we also got to use some new tools by iWis and iCrimp, and those are really awesome. So I'm going to continue to use the Deutschwerk type connectors, and those are great. So overall, very satisfied with this harness. It is absolutely the cleanest that I have done yet. Very organized, and it's very serviceable, and it's nice. So really happy with it. There is still some tape on the bars. Of course, I'm going to get this thing together and determine if I want to cut down the bars, maybe an inch or something like that. Once we have that decision, I'll internally route them and just do finalized cable routing for the handlebar controls. But functionally, everything works as it should, so that's good. Now, of course, this video is meant to pair with other wiring videos that I have, so be sure to check out the playlist that this video is within. I have a lot of information out there as far as different tools and components that I use, so there's some good stuff to watch out there. But with all that being said, I know this is a long video. There's just a lot to talk about and a lot of different things to show you, and this is the only way that I know how. But if you stuck it out this long, you're awesome. So look for the next video on this bike dedicated to the ignition system specifically, if that interests you. And then soon enough, we should have a first start video. So look forward to that as well. But I'm gonna wrap it up here. Hope you guys liked it, and I hope to see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.